So the Mishnah said, if you want to expand on your shalayim, if you want to consecrate it, there's a whole process, including having the Urim and Tumim, the king, the Navi. Moshe Rabbeinu himself was a melech, as we're learning more as well, and he was a Navi. Aaron was a Kohen Gadol, they had Urim and Tumim, they had the two Taidas that they brought up, and Bashir and the songs that we learned all about yesterday. So, Kol Shanoi Nasr Cholei, we brought yesterday in the bottom of the page. That question is, do you have to use all of those criteria the Mishnah mentioned, or just any of them? So we had a machlekes, and now we'll explore this machlekes. Rav Huna says, you have to do all of these steps in order for this expansion of Shalayim, for example, to take place. Rav Nachman says, you can use any one of them, just the song, just the title, any one of them is sufficient. So Tanan, everything that's in any one of them. Says Rav Huna says, I'm going to explain what's the crux of the argument. Rav Huna says, Bichol Elu Tanan, all of them, because what he holds, and we had this a number of times, this machlekes, and within the machlekes, we had a number of machlekes in the Rishonim. It goes on forever. But the machlekes is, when the Eden went with Yeshua and conquered Eretz Yisrael, they sanctified the land through kibush, the conquering. And the question is, was that conquest and that consecration eternal, or is it just as long as the Eden were in Eretz Yisrael, and after the Churban Beis Hamikdash, when the Eden were evicted, the Kedusha was gone, and when Ezra went up a second time, he had to be Mekadosh again, or there was no point in Ezra being Mekadosh again, because Kedusha Rishayna, Kitcha L'Shaita, V'Kitcha L'Asulava, it's eternal, or do we say Loi Kitcha L'Asulava? Kedusha Shniya, and that is also Machlekes. If Kedusha Shniya, the second one, when Ezra came, but that Kedusha remained permanent or not. And then that's the Machlekes and the Tanoim. Then you have a Machlekes Rishonim whether there's two parts. There's Eretz Yisrael as a land, so Yechayiv and Truma and Ma'aser Yisrael today as it holy was then. And there's another section about the Beis Hamikdash and Yerushalayim. If they continue with that Kedusha, and therefore you're not allowed to go on the Temple Mount today, just like you're not allowed to go then. So you have a Machlekes the Rambam the Ravid, for example, regarding the Beis Hamikdash, if that Kedusha still goes on or not. And then as many Rishonim want to de-link or decouple these two and say they have nothing to do with each other. Because as Tosfos here explains, that Yerushalayim and the Beis Hamikdash, the Kedusha happened from building Mechitza's walls. And the walls disappear, then the Kedusha maybe has gone. Eretz Yisrael, it's not the walls of Eretz Yisrael, it's the land itself. Maybe the Kedusha stays on, or the converse, that the Kedusha does not stay on Eretz Yisrael anymore, but in the Beis Hamikdash, even though the walls are removed, the walls are sort of artificial, doesn't matter. Why is the wall different than Eretz Yisrael? So Tosfos explains other places, because the walls, the Goyim came in and they broke the walls. So they came in, and like we had by the Mizbech, when they came in, they took away some of the Kedusha. And therefore the Kedusha of Yerushalayim, Beis Hamikdash, perhaps does not continue, while the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, they didn't destroy the actual in the land of Eretz Yisrael, and therefore the Kedusha remains on. Different opinions. But now we're going to say the argument of these Tomaroim hinge on this argument about the Kedusha that Yeshua made continued on or not. And if the Kedusha did continue on, then why do we find that Ezra went ahead and did whatever they did? It's more symbolic. So interesting. Because, as the Gemara explained, because it's merely symbolic, they did everything. And if it's not symbolic, if Ezra and Nehemiah had to be makdish, Yerushalayim and everything else, then at that time they didn't have Urim v'Tumim. King Yoshio took it away. So therefore, you'll have to learn that any one of those steps is sufficient. And that's what the Gemara says here. So Rav Huna, we learned all of them, all the steps, because somebody holds Kedusha, it's still Kaddish today. And Ezra merely Zeicha, Ezra just went ahead and did the Zeicha. And therefore Zeicha did everything exactly the way it was. And Rav Nachman says, Ba'achas mekol elu tnan, any one of these steps, because somebody holds Kedusha l'shayna, Kitcha l'shayta, v'loy Kitcha l'slave. They couldn't rely on what Yeshua did. Ezra had to once again consecrate the Shalayim and Beis Hamikdash and so on. Is the Ezra Kedusha Kaddish? He had to be makdashit. But how was he able to? You were lacking some of the things. Rashi says we're lacking omitz melech. So because some say the reason why omitz melech is because a nasi b'Yisrael can be considered legally as a melech. Therefore, they had a melech, Ezra himself, or it's a mission in Rashi, and it should be in there as well. Avagav the law having urim v'tumim. There's no urim v'tumim. And the Gemara right here, it says there was no urim v'tumim. Do we also add the word melech? Says the Gemara, Eisvei Rav Nachman. So Rav asked Rav Nachman a question. Rav Nachman is the one who says, Be'achas mikol elu, even one of them, because he holds that the Kedusha, the Shaina, teacher l'shaita, v'loi teacher l'osalov. So Rav asked another question. It says in Mishnah clearly, Kol shaloi nasis b'chol elu. It says clearly, b'chol elu. If you didn't use, it sounds like all the steps, nothing happens. So the Gemara, Tni be'achas mikol elu. Don't say all of them, it means any one of them. Any one of them. And not as the Rishonim say, not to take away the question, but not that he's actually amending the Mishnah, because there's no point in amending the Mishnah. You can just say that our Mishnah holds, like those Tanoim that say that the Kedusha Rishonim is Kitchel Losalovin. And therefore, it was only symbolic, and that's why our Mishnah holds that you have to do them all. However, it's just interpreting the words of the Mishnah. Okay, Toshma coming here. Abba Shol says, there were two like pools of water in the Haramishcha. There was on the bottom of the hill and on top of the hill. This is a Harazasim. And this the bottom one, they did all of these steps. Which according to Rav Nachman, they did it because it's symbolic, because the Kedusha of the Shayna was still there. Elyoina was never Kaddish in the times of Yehoshua. So they didn't make it Kaddish using all of these. It was done the second time around by those who went up with Ezra, without the king, not use Urim. So it's, and now we're going to say that the one below, the one beneath, Taka is Kodesh. The one beneath is Kodesh. And therefore, we'll soon see what they did there. But the one on top, because they didn't do B'kol Eila, sounds like that they didn't become Kodesh, because they didn't use everything. And the Gemara explained. It says, the Tachtoina, which is a complete Kedusha, because they used everything. The Amaratzim would eat within the confines of the wall. Because Kachim Kalim can be eaten anywhere in Yerushalayim. And Avoloi Maisa Sheni, they did not eat the Maisa Sheni. Maisa Sheni, every third and sixth year, you had to bring 10% of the produce to Yerushalayim, or the equivalent in money. And the Amaratzim, Reiv Amaratzim Asane, most of them gave Maisa. And they were Machmed. They decided that they're not happy with the extension. They wanted to be much closer to this epicenter of Yerushalayim, Lifnei Hashem Elokecha. Now, why? They were very frum. In fact, they were frum in the Tamil Chachamim when it comes to Ma'aser Sheni. Why? So all the Rishonim say, because since they gave Ma'aser Sheni, they said Vidui, and the Vidui in the pasuk there, it says V'achalta Lifnei Hashem Elokecha. So they wanted to do that right. But Rashi adds a fascinating thing here. Rashi adds, it says in the pasuk, Asher Aser, you should give Ma'aser. Asa to Asa, so we learned in the Gemara times, Asa b'shvil shetisasha. By giving Meiser, you will become wealthier. So they decided they're going to be machmir with Meiser Sheni because they wanted that bracha. Avisha says, you can test me when it comes to Meiser, and I will carry out. Remember, taste of this, the beautiful story there. They didn't give Meiser Sheni, and they kept on losing the value of their field, and the crop didn't yield as much as it used to. In fact, it only yielded at 10% of what it did the previous year. So the Amaratzim or Machmir, they wanted to make sure that all these gulas that they have to do with Ashiris, they would go ahead and do them properly. Far better than the Tamil Chamim. The Chavedim, the Tamil Chamim, Oichlin Sham Kachim Kala, Ma'aser Sheni. Api Halacha, it had the status of Yerushalayim, and they would eat their Ma'aser Sheni as well. How about but the Elyoina, the one above? This is what we're talking about here, wetlands. That was above. It says clearly the Kedusha is not Gemara. Now, why wasn't it a complete Kedusha? Because he didn't go through all the steps. So it seems from here, if he didn't go through all the steps, even the one who says that you have to go through all the steps, not that nothing happened. It's not enough Kedusha, you did something, but not enough to enable you to eat Kachim there, Kachim Kalim, or to eat Ma'aser Sheni. If the din is, the Amaratzim would go there. When it came to Kachim Kalim, they wouldn't from it all. As long as if there's a wall there, they thought good enough. They would not eat the Ma'aser Sheni. But in this case, the Chavedim, They eat nothing there. Why would they eat nothing there? Because there's no kedusha, not sufficient kedusha to be able to eat kachikalim. What do we see from it clearly? That if you did not use all the steps, it doesn't become kodesh. And don't tell me it was kodesh from times Yeshua, because the Chavenim did not eat it. So why Taka didn't they make it holy? And you know why? So the Braisa spells it out. You cannot expand the city or the base of Migdash. You need this is the criteria. You need a king. You need a Navi like Moshe Rabbeinu. You need Uriv Tumim. You need a Sanhedrin Shel Ayin Aleph. You need a Sanhedrin of Ayin Aleph and Uvishtei Titus Uvishir. You need all that. The Lama Kichua. So then the obvious question is, so why did they make it holy? Why did they make it holy? What was the point? Why did they go ahead and go through some of the steps when, in a way, they misled the public? Because the public now thought that this is the Kodesh, when in fact it wasn't. So first of all, they want to ask a question. What do you mean, why did they make it Kodesh? You just said that they weren't Mekadosh it. Why did they expand the wall and even do anything? Why did they do that? Says the Gemara, the reason why they built the wall there is because this made it was a very high point, and from there, Chas v'Shalom, the enemies can get there, they can harm the Eden. So therefore, they built a wall over there, and because otherwise the Yerushalayim would be very vulnerable. But they couldn't be mekadosh it because they were lacking some of the criteria that you needed. The noichel chavish mishal. Anyway, clear brisa that the kedusha from the times of Yeshua did not linger on. The Kasher of Nachman. Because Nachman said that the Kedusha continues. Anyway, so what's shot? Sorry. So Nachman said that the Kedusha does not continue. So how can there be anybody who said that the Kedusha continues? Says the Gemara, and now that Rav Nachman said that it's enough to do one of them. Here you see clearly from the Bryce, it's not enough to do one of them because that's why they weren't Mekadosh in the times of Ezra. Why weren't they Mekadosh in the times of Ezra? Because they didn't have the Urim Tumim. Says the Gemara, you should know, true. Tanoi is actually a machlekes Tanoim, whether Kedusha, the Shaina, Kitchel, the Asid Lava or not. The Tanya we learned, Abba said, Shemaiti, I heard, when they were building the base of Mikdash, it took 22 years to build the base of Mikdash in times of Ezra. Had all these hurdles and challenges from the locals who constantly tried to prevent them from and impede the building of the base of Mikdash. So what they did was, in the building of the base of Mikdash, Asu Klayim Lehechel. They made curtains. They made curtains there, and for the inner base of Mikdash, and the Klayim La'azaris, and curtain Azaris, because when you bring in the Mizbech, it has to be Lifnei Pesach Oil Moed, so they wanted to have the Kedusha of an Oil Moed, so they built curtains there as well. And so they had these curtains. And then they built the walls around them. In other words, till the walls are up and running, they needed some kind of kedusha, so they built these curtains. They would have the curtains on the inside, and the walls are built on the outside. And the reason is we don't want the construction workers to see what's going on inside the heichel. So therefore, they were building outside of the curtains. And what was the purpose, the role of these curtains? The role of these curtains was to give it kedusha, because you needed the walls to give it kedusha to the Eil Mayid and to the Azara. Yesterday we learned to asking a question: how can you build, on Shavuos? Why can't we use the 2 loaves of bread from Shavuos? So we said you cannot build on Yom Tov. Why couldn't they just put the curtains there? So it seems that even just putting curtains, if the curtains are there as an imaginary house, an imaginary wall, to complete a house is also a problem. And they couldn't do that on Yom Tov. Anyway, but when it came to the courtyard, they were the other way around. The curtains on the outside, and they would be building from the inside. They would be building from the inside, so they can be inside the Azara. So what do we see from here? So there wasn't automatically Kodesh. They had to have curtains there to create the Kedusha. In other words, there was not like Kitchel. However, I heard That no, it's still kodesh without the curtains. Shemakrivin afapisha ain't bias. You can bring karbanas even though there's no base of mikdash. Oichlin kotche kotche mafish and kloin. They could have eaten the karbanas even though there were no curtains there. Why? Because the kedusha, the Yeshua put into place, still there. Kotche kalim, ma'ashen afish and chayim. The entire shalom they can eat kotche kalim. B'nei kedusha the shayim the kitchel the shaytim kitchel lasalave. So it seems that now according to Rabbi Yeshua there were no curtains, and according to Rabbi Lezer, there were curtains. See, that's what they're arguing about, whether curtains were necessary in order to make it kodesh, or there was no need for it because already kodesh. Rab Mikal does not prove that Rabbi Lezer saw like kitchel lasalave. There was no kedusha lasalave. Who told you? Maybe everyone agrees that the kedusha remained forever. Each was telling you what they heard, a historical fact, yes or no, nothing to do with halacha. If you tell me it was still kodesh, why taka did they have to place curtains there? Why did they have curtains? So the Gemara says you thought the purpose of the curtains was to make it kedusha. No, let's news of alma is only for discretion. So therefore, there's no proof from here that they're arguing in kedusha the shayna kitchel the shaita kitchel osalava, and even though. And so all the Rishonim talk about Rabbi Lezer in other places when he talks about Eretz Yisrael, he holds clearly that Eretz Yisrael l'chayla was not kodesh, because it says that they left out certain parts of Eretz Yisrael. They decided in Ezra and Nehemiah they went up to not to make kodesh, so that the poor in the year of Shemitah the farms will be able to farm over there, and the poor will be able to get their meiser ani. So, but if you tell me it's automatically kodesh, you couldn't farm there. So that proves that the holds kedusha the shayna kitchel shayva like kitchel lasalave. How can the Gemara say over here that the kedusha still lingers on? So based on this, many of the shaynim want to decouple the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael from the kedusha of Yerushalayim and Beis Hamikdash. The Yerushalayim Beis Hamikdash kedusha according to Rabbi Lezer is still today, and you're not allowed to walk on the Temple Mount. You'll be chayiv kares, just like the Beis Hamikdash is still standing. And Erev Pesach, you're in Yerushalayim after Chatzos. You got a big issue there about bringing a korban Pesach. If you were there right before Chatzos, but the Eretz Yisrael is different, and he holds Yisrael is not kodesh, and therefore you don't have to give truma mahatorah. These questions all came up in the 1880s when Rothschild, when they built Petah Tikva and all these farms, they wanted to know mahatorah, regarding Shemitah and truma maishas, is it mahatorah? The kedusha still goes on, or midrabanan, and Avineza was heavily involved, and others. And basically, the pasuk at the time that it's mainly most of the pasuk is only rabbanon. Therefore, you have all of these different ways of circumnavigating the issues of shemitah and so on. Ella, I will learn Erchin what happened to the majority of the Jewish populations in Israel. What happens then when the Yabel comes back, which they're starting to talk about, it might be very soon. And we'll talk about it when we get there. The Tanya we learn, I'll tell you who the argument is, which Tanya. The Tanya we learned, there's a thing called Bati Arachayma. If you live in a walled city from the times of Yehoshua, the dinim, if you sell a house, is very different than anywhere else. Anywhere else you sell a house, if you don't redeem it, comes Yovel, it comes back to you anyway. But when it comes to Bati Arachayma, you have 1 year only to redeem it. And we talk about if you have a family member, they can redeem it on your behalf. But once the year is over, you forfeit any rights to that house. So the question is, which cities are considered, which cities are Orechayma? And Orechayma, any city that had a wall from the times of Yeshua, according to some. So we go like this. So why is it that Ezra, why is it that Monach HaChamim, the Mishnah lists a whole bunch of cities that were, that were nominated, that they made Kodesh when Ezra and Nehemiah came up? Why is that? Because when they went up, Ezra and Nehemiah went up, they found all of these cities, the kitchen, they made it holy. So what does he clear from here? They say that these cities were no longer Kodesh. It's only when Ezra and Nehemiah decided to make a Kodesh, it became Kodesh. How exactly they made a Kodesh, Rashi says, interesting, he doesn't know. He doesn't know how they made it Kodesh. However, others say you made a Kodesh through using words, saying Kedusha, or singing a song. Or others, there's a thesis in another place that says that they brought a korban Torah, which brought a whole bunch of questions. People ask, how can you bring a korban Torah outside of Yerushalayim? It doesn't become possible. Others want to say, but since the purpose of the korban Torah, first of all, the Beis Hamikdash wasn't standing yet, so maybe it's not a problem. But also the purpose of and it's because no Beis Hamikdash is mainly bamas, and bamas you can build anywhere. And that was the korban Torah right there. Or maybe since the korban Torah's purpose was in order to Mekadosh the cities, maybe it's not called Yaitse, leaving the confines of Yerushalayim. He clearly made that it was not Kodesh. You had to do something to make it Kodesh. But when that's a question, he says the same Rabbi Shmuel but Rabbi Yasi in the second price said, only these cities. It says already in Pasuk in Chumash. It says that Shishim 60 cities, along the coast, along the boundary there from the kingdom of Eimal Bashan. All of these cities were fortified cities with walls. They were tall. But and this price holds, they were all Kodesh. Because Kedusha Shina did continue. Automatically it's perpetuated. So why only list certain cities? That what when the Braisa says, so when they saw these particular cities, they made them holy, which obviously contradicts itself. A minute ago, you said they're all holy by itself, naturally. Kitchum, hashtamin lekamad letzichl, because you just said you don't have to be mekadosh because the kedusha l'shayna is kishos loving. Elamot elu umanum, that they counted, they nominated the city because this is on their trek from Babel. They went to Israel. They passed through all of these cities, so they just named them. Oh, but the truth of the matter is, it's not only these cities that had the walls. Any city that you have a tradition from your ancestors that had walls around it from the time of Shubinun, call mitzvahs elu nohagas. But all of these mitzvahs continue. No, they're treated like a bate oruchayim, exactly like a bate oruchayim. Including, for example, a Mitzvah has to be evicted from the city, quarantined, and also that you're not allowed to, there's 1,000 amas or 2,000 amas around the city, not used for other purposes. All of those laws apply because it's treated as if there's a wall around them still. But they should do showing the kitchen right, the kitchen was allowed. Says the Gemara, I don't understand. Okay, you tell me it's machlekes tanaim, but it's the same Tana in both prices. How can that be? Kasha Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yasi. So you boys say, but one answer is Trei Tanoi Li Rabbi Shmuel. Two students in the name of Rabbi Shmuel argue what Rabbi Shmuel actually said by Yasi. Or you boys say, there's an error here. It's not Rabbi Shmuel by Yasi. One of them was Rabbi Lazar by Yasi. Chadim Nai Rabbi Lazar by Yasi. The time we learned Rabbi Lazar by Yasi Ayman. It says in Pasuk regarding by Batir Chayma, it says that the one, if a year goes by and you don't redeem it back, the one who bought it keeps it forever. And it says that Ashaloi Chayma, a city, a year that Loi Chayma. What's odd about it is it's written Lamed Aleph, Lamed Vav Aleph. So you can read it, there's no wall, but Lamed Vav means they did have a wall. So which one is it? A walled city or an unwalled city? So we darshan. It once upon a time had a wall, even though today, Loi with an Aleph, it doesn't have a wall. Why? Because the first Kedusha continues. So we see from here, the way many Rishonim learn is that the rules of a walled city have the same thing like Yerushalayim, a wall. And this is the basis for those Rishonim who say why Yerushalayim, Beis Hamikdash are different than Eretz Yisrael is because it's all about the wall. Because where are we learning from? We're learning from the pasuk about a walled city. It's all about the wall, and therefore, a walled city, perhaps there's no longer any kedushin into the wall disappears. Mashenkin et Yisrael, or the other way around. That a walled city is the kedusha remains. Mashenkin et Yisrael, because of different sources for that kedusha. Okay, on the base and top of the page. Going back to our Mishnah, we're still talking about Tumah until the end of this parak. So, but in the Mishnah it says, if you became tamei while you were standing inside the Beis Hamikdash in the courtyard, nitma ba'azara. So we had in the Mishnah, in the first Mishnah, we had shtayim shein arba. You knew you were tamei, you forgot, you walked in the Beis Hamikdash, and then you remembered. You knew you were tamei, you forgot, you ate kachim, and then you remembered. And then the two additional ones, you knew you were tamei, but you forgot that this was Beis Hamikdash, or you knew you were tamei, you forgot that this was kodesh. Then now in this Mishnah here, we go a step further and we say, what happens? You didn't, tamei. You walked into the Beis Hamikdash. You became tamei inside the Beis Hamikdash itself, and then you forgot. Nitma, and why we don't add that in the first Mishnah of this Masechta, Shtayim Shem Arba, called Shtayim Shem Sheish, because really no difference as far as that is concerned. Whether you became tamei outside and you entered the Beis Hamikdash when you shouldn't have, or you became tamei in the Beis Hamikdash and you didn't walk out like you should have. It says the Gemara, Nitma ba'azara v'nel menatuma. Tumah ba'azara minalam. How did you become tamei nazara? That because the pasuk says, "Don't walk into the Beis Hamikdash when you're tamei." How do you know that when you're inside the Beis Hamikdash you became tamei? You get chorus and all that. Does the Gemara? It says in one pasuk, don't walk into the base of Mikdash because Mishkan Hashem Time. You are contaminating, defiling the Mishkan of Hashem, and you'll get cutters for that. And then you have another pasuk basically saying the same thing. Because just a few psukim later, it says in the pasuk that if you became tamei and you didn't purify yourself, then you should get chorus. Why? Because Migdash Hashem Timeh, because you walked in and you mekadosh, you metame the base of Migdash. Why do we need two psukim, basically, repeating itself? So we say, one is talking about you became tamei outside, don't enter, and the other one is talking about even though you're inside and became tamei and you didn't walk out straight away, you're chayiv kares. So how do you know? Because there's an extra pasuk. So you want to ask the kroy and miyata. You tell me it's an extra pasuk. In fact, we need the two psukim. Why? Because in the first pasuk it says, "As Mishkan Hashem Timei," you defile the Mishkan of Hashem, and the second pasuk says, "Ki as Mikdash Hashem Timei," you defile the Mikdash of Hashem. Now, l'chayda, it's the same thing, and yet we need the two psukim to teach us that Mikdash has the same din as Mishkan. So in other words, a totally different halacha we're trying to glean from this pasuk. Nothing to do with where you became tamei. Now, why do we need two psukim, one for the Mishkan and one for the Mikdash? It should be the same principle. So the Gemara explains, no, we need it. The Tanya, Rabbi says, you never Mishkan, Mikdash. Why do you have to repeat the same din when it comes to the base of Mikdash? Or Mishkan, what do you need both for? So he explained this. Even Nema Mishkan, if all we knew about was you're not allowed to go into the Mishkan when you're tummy. But like Nema Migdash did not mention a word about Migdash. I would have said, on Mishkan, I would have said on the Mishkan, Yehei Chayiv. I would say, it makes sense. The Mishkan, you're Chayiv, because the Mishkan is very special. Shahari Moshuach b'Shemen HaMishkan. The Mishkan was anointed with the Shemen HaMishkan. For nothing else was. Remember a few days ago. Everything else became Avodah Mechan Chosron. It's only when you work with it. But Shenke the Mishkan, just putting that special oil on it. And in fact, we learned that the Mishkan was never destroyed. The Mishkan, they buried it under the base of Mikdash somewhere, and until this day we haven't found it, but it's there somewhere. It was never destroyed because it's so holy, sacred. So therefore, if you walk in Tameh, you're chayiv kares. But maybe if you enter the base of Mikdash when you were Tameh, the Kedusha is a step lower. Maybe you're not chayiv kares. No, so let it just say Mikdash. The im nama Migdash Mishkan, I would say this. No, I Migdash chayiv. Share kedusha soy kedusha's olam. The kedusha is forever, and therefore, if you go ahead and defile it, it's a blight forever. But a Mishkan lo chayiv. But the Mishkan maybe you're not chayiv because it's only temporary. Now, what exactly means kedusha olam? We just had a big machlekes whether the kedusha is olam or not. So Rashi learns that kedusha olam means literally that kedusha is showing the kitchel shaita of the kitchel lava. You can no longer use bombas, and therefore that's what it means kedusha olam. So the other Rishonim say no, it doesn't mean that because we're also talking about according to the opinion that kedusha is showing the kitchel shaita of the kitchel lava, and so the pshat is kedusha olam means either it rained or the base Mikdash is standing longer than any mishkan, including mishkan Shile, which was 360 years. This is longer. Or that even though it might not be a holy site today, the third base of Mikdash is going to be rebuilt on this very site. So the kedusha there, the potential kedusha is there. There's where it's going to be. Or as the Ritva says, the Shechina is constantly resting there, even now when there's, let's say, behold, that's not kodesh anymore. The kachna mishkan, kachna Mikdash. So the we need it for that. The Gemara explains. No, Rabbi is saying the following: Mechdi. Let's say we're going to learn your halacha. It says twice. Once you became tamei outside and you entered. Once you became tamei inside and you remain inside. Mishkan ikra Mikdash or Mikdash ikra Mishkan. But my question is to teach that din. It could have said both psukim, but use the same word for both. Since Mishkan and Mikdash are interchangeable, say the same thing twice. You would defile the Mishkan twice, or say you defile the Mikdash twice, and I would know tumah b'chutz, tumah b'fnim. Why do you change the word around? To teach you something else. Why change the word? To teach you also that it applies not only to the Mishkan, but also to the Mikdash. Says the Gemara, your premise was that they both are interchangeable. How do you know? I know the Mikdash is called Mishkan. It says the pasuk when Asati Mishkani b'teichem, I'll place my Mishkan between you, amongst you, which means wherever you'll be, I'll call it Mishkan. Or Rashi says elsewhere, I already.
You got to transfer.
Barry, or as the Rashi says in other places, you already had the Mishkan standing when this pasuk was said, and yet it says, I will give the Mishkan." Obviously, he's talking about the future, the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, so I know that the Mishkan can refer to the Beis Hamikdash. And the Mishkan, the Mishkan. How do you know that when it says Beis Hamikdash, it means the Mishkan as well? That they should travel the members of Kahas, those who carry the Migdash. The Migdash there is not referring to the Mishkan or to the Migdash. Ahu be'arak said they carried a holy object, the Aron. It says, "Also in Migdash build me a Migdash and I will rest there." And the Ksiv says, and then you will build yourself exactly the form of the Mishkan. So we see Mishkan and Migdash are interchangeable. Okay, then it says v'hishtachava, and let's say you became tummy in the base of English, and you bowed down while you were tummy, or shashah kadesh tachava. Even if you didn't bow down, so when we read the Mishnah, literally means either you bow down, and that l'chayda takes time, or if you didn't bow down, but the time that it would take to bow down. That's what it sounds in the Mishnah. Omar Rabba says, so Rabba is going to come along and say that even if you bow down, sometimes you need to bow down for a longer period, Kadei Shia. In those, Rabba is going to introduce us the idea that two stages of bowing down, or the two time lengths. There's one bowing down where it takes an instant, and if you did that, you're chayav kar straight away. And then there's another bowing down which takes a lot longer. And if we say that you hung around the base of Mikdash without walking out, the time it takes to bow down, we're talking about the longer bowing down, as we'll explain. He's talking about you bow down facing the base of Mikdash. Then we say that you're chayiv straight away, chorus, for not walking out. But if you're facing the other way, shah in lo shah. If you're facing the other way, if you were shah, if you waited, even if you bow down, but if you're facing away from the base of Mikdash, if you spent the time that it takes to bow down, you're chayiv. Otherwise, not. That's one version. The other version is basically the same outcome, but just he interprets the different part of the Mishnah. Iked Masla say from the end of the Mishnah. It says that, but if you waited there long enough to bow down, then what? You chayiv kares. Michlal. So it seems from here. It says that the time it takes to bow down, which means bowing down takes time. Amar Rava says Rava, it depends. When do we say that the bowing down requires time if you're facing away from the base of Mikdash? Facing the base of Mikdash, even though it didn't take time. And this is how you read it. You bow down facing the base of Mikdash, then you chayav kar straight away for not walking out once you found out you were tummy. Or if you're facing the other direction. If you're bowing down facing away from the base of Mikdash, then that takes longer. What are these two shtachavos? One you say takes time. That's if you're facing away from the base of Mikdash. And the other one, if you're facing the base of Mikdash, the one that takes an instant. The lesbashir, what's the shtachava that doesn't take any time? Zukriya balma, just bending down a second. What's the izbashir? What's the shtachava that takes time? Pishut yadayim v'raglayim. That's if you lie down, you spread yourself out, hands and feet. That takes more time. That's the one that takes more time. The kamashir shir, how long is that? An argument of Yitzchak Bar Nachmani and a member who was with him, a man of Shimon Pazi. The other say that Shimon Pazi v'chadim and Yitzchak Bar Nachmani. I have no idea why the two versions, unless the name that you mentioned first is more chashuv than the second one, and therefore the other one is just an ancillary. It's the first one that's the most important one. That's what the two versions are. Who's more important? And another say that Shimon Nachmani. But there's a pasuk that you have. This is the time that it takes to say this pasuk. One of them said to say the entire pasuk, and the other one said no, only from the words the vayichru, from that part of the pasuk and onwards. What is the pasuk? The pasuk says the Chol B'nai Yisrael, all the Eden, Royim Beredes Eish, they also when the fire came down. The Chvoid Hashem al Abayis, neighbors of on the house, and now starts Vayichru. So according to the second opinion, you start from here. Vayichru Apayim Arza al Arispa Vayishtachad Badan V'Hoid Hashem Kitayv Dom Chazan. I mean, how long is that already? But that's the longer version. What we learned? There's three kinds of bowing down. There's kiddah, and then there is shtachava. What's kiddah? Kiddah is, and then there's kriya. Kiddah is alapayim. It's like this is a special talent that they had, and we had actually more sukkah. We had other places that Levi, you sort of stand straight, I mean, you could bend your knees a little bit, but you're so agile that you can put your head down and touch the ground while you're upstanding, while you're standing, without having your knees touch the ground. And they would put their and use their thumbs, maybe whatever it is, but they have the head touching the ground. So that was kid is, and that's very very difficult to do. The chenos of Atika Basheva Paim and Eretz. She did it twice. She bent down and put her head on the ground. Kriya, which is the more popular one, Al Bikaim, kneel on the knees. That's the chenu oimet a mikra because he kneels on his knees. The ishtachava, bowing down, zupishit your daim. Ishtachava is you're spreading out completely your hands and your feet. And we will come and we'll bow down to you on the ground. That's Yaakov saying there. Are we going to bow down to you? Okay, now starts a new Gemara and it goes on. Okay, just go quickly. Boy, Rava has a few questions.
Hi, Julian.
Sorry, we're in the bottom of the page. Says I know base, the very last two lines.
For
Rava
Yom
wants to
Kippur,
know. We said that when it comes to chorus, you're told you were tameh, you have to wait a little bit, and then if you didn't walk out straight away, you're chayiv. What about when it comes to Malchus? They warned him and they gave him a warning, and they said you better go out, not only your tummy, but you better walk out. Sarich shehi Malchus. So for Malchus as well, does he have to? He's only chayiv Malchus if he hangs around a little bit. Ain't sarich shehi Malchus. What happens if he stayed 1 second? If he ran out straight away, one thing. But if he remained there 1 second, is that enough that he should sufficient that he should get Malchus, or he has to remain there? Shia, just like we said before, when it comes to a carbon, he forgot and he brings a carbon. So Gemara says, Dilma is much like this. The carbon gemidi, only when it comes to a carbon do we say that you need shehiyah. But with the Malchus legimidi, we have no such understanding when it comes to Malchus. So therefore, you chai Malchus if you didn't walk out straight away. It's not about carbon, it's about generally this kind of Aveda is only an Aveda if you spent a certain amount of time there. Take remains the question. Next question. We have a few questions there. The question. Tola atzmai ba'avir. What happens if you were not on the ground? You're actually, there's a peg hanging somewhere on it, and you hung yourself on the peg, and you found out you were tummy. So when we say that you have to be there long enough to bow down, is that just a timetable? Or you have to have the ability, the potential to bow down, and therefore you're high because you could have bowed down. Now, suspended in the tree, you can't bow down. You're not on the ground. You're not on the floor. So now, if you're able to bend down, to bow down, you're high. But if you didn't. So it's a timetable, the time it takes to bow down. But I don't care if you're able to bow down or not. You're chayiv. Teku. The question whether you're three in carbon or not. What happens? Let's say you tell me that when it comes to Malchus, you do need you have to pause there a little bit, and we say, we warned you, and you remain there long enough to bow down, you are going to receive Malchus. So what happens? And that's talking about you didn't know you became tummy. What happened when you became tummy? You had no idea, and then they told you about it. So they gave you a warning. Now remaining there, you're like amazed. But what happens if you became tummy b'mazed? In this case here, you're much worse because you knew you were tummy, and you touched a sheriff deliberately. It wasn't a question of not knowing. It wasn't an accident, and they told you better walk out. They warned you, and you didn't. Do we also give you a certain amount of breathing time? If we follow that by in the other case we do, or in this case here, no, we don't give you any breathing time. You'll get Malchus straight away. Do we say only if it's not your fault? Do we say, well, it's not his fault, so we're going to give him a little bit of time? When we're not going to give you any leniencies at all, and if you're chayiv straight away Malchus, it's not about your behavior. It's about inside the base of Mikdash. In order to be chayiv, the avera, you have to be there long enough to bow down. I don't care how it happened. It's a question. One more question. Nazir b'kever. If a Nazir is standing in the kever, he's standing in a cemetery. A Nazir is not allowed to become Tameh. He becomes Tameh. He has to recount the whole Naziris. First, he has to become Torah. He brings a carbon chatas, but that carbon chatas is not a kapara. That carbon chatas is that according to most, that korban, even though we had the one opinion that says it's a kapara, but that korban chatas is to like a mechusik kapurim. If someone is tamei before he can start eating karbanas, they have to first not only go to the mikveh and wait for sunset, they have to bring karbanas. You need to bring korban chatas to be able to restart, to recalibrate your whole naziris. So you're standing in the base of quarters, and you shouldn't be there. And they warned him, you better go out. The question is, does he need to, like by basic mikdash, does he have to be there a few seconds or not? Now, the Chayda, all the Rishonim want to know, if he's tamei already, what's the problem then? What are you warning him? Go out. What's the big deal? He's tamei anyway. What's it matter if he becomes tamei a little bit longer? And there's a whole discussion we had in Masechta Nazir about a concept called chiburin. If you already were holding one mace, a coin, let's say, you're already touching one mace, he's allowed to add more mace. Anyway, so some of the Rishonim, just to make it easy, some of the Rishonim say that it's talking about over here, it's the last second of the day. And if you stay there any longer, you'll be there now another day, which means you're delaying your Naziris. Because remember, you have to wait 7 clean days before you can start and restart Naziris again. So you delayed your Naziris by another day. And therefore, it's a problem. The question is, how long do you have to stay? Kadeshi or not? The fnim gemiri shehia b'chudlag gemiri shehia. Do we say in the inside you gemiri shehia, but not on the outside? Again, it doesn't. Or do we say, I don't care if you're inside, if you're outside, that you're a chayev malchus regardless. Do we say that? Do we say that only inside the base of media, not outside, or do we say it makes no difference, and therefore over here it should be chayev? The obvious question that everyone wants to know is, isn't this a lav she'ein by Maisa? Let's say he remains in the Beis HaKvaros. He remains in the Beis HaKvaros. So where's the Malkus over there? It's a lav she'ein by Maisa. He didn't do anything. So he stayed. He didn't listen. What's going on here? So some want to say that we don't really mean Malkus. We mean the Isser of Malkus. Did he do the Isser of Malkus? Not that he gets Malkus. But others want to say, this is the long Shagis Aryeh and Mishnah Melech, everybody talks about this. Other ones that Taisus and other Rishonim want to say, that is, since it all started with a Maisa, you walked into the Beis HaKvaros, that Maisa you originally did, we added on to what you're doing right now. It's as if every minute that you remain behind in the Beis HaKvaros, as if it came through an activity, because you walked into the cemetery. And the discussion is, the other answer to the discussion is, when you walked in the cemetery, you what do you call it? Okay, maybe you didn't know how do we work this whole thing out? What happens if you? Bottom line is, we take the ma'aser without going to whole pool. You take the ma'aser that you initially did, and we add it to what you're doing now. It's transformed into a lav sheyesh by ma'aser. And the same question of Beis Hamikdash. You walked into the Beis Hamikdash, you didn't walk out, and we're talking about malchus. What kind of malchus? You didn't do any ma'aser. So over there, they say it means an iser of malchus, not that you will actually get malchus itself. Okay, have a good walk, everybody. Shavuos Daf. We'll see you.